The courthouse corridor was a place designed to erase individuality. Fluorescent light hummed from ceiling panels, washing every face in pallor. The floor, a stretch of polished stone, reflected shoes and shadows with cold precision. Rows of metal benches lined the walls, too narrow to invite comfort, too cold to encourage conversation. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, as though even the faintest trace of humanity had to be scrubbed away. Against this backdrop, people moved like pieces on a board, defendants shuffling with paperwork in hand, attorneys brisk with their briefcases, clerks carrying stacks of files high against their chests. Every motion was functional. Nothing in this space was permitted to be soft. The officer stood near the double doors leading to the hearing chamber. He was still as a post, uniform pressed to rigid flatness, shoes polished to reflect the harsh ceiling lights. His badge caught the fluorescence at intervals, glinting like a signal. He watched the flow of bodies with a gaze that scanned and dismissed, his posture declaring both control and indifference. Then she entered. The woman walked with unhurried steps, the sound of her heels measured and deliberate against the floor. Her dress was simple, dark, her coat folded neatly across her arm. She carried no papers, no phone in her hand, no visible sign of urgency, only presence. Her gaze was steady, not lowered, not challenging, but anchored in some quiet center of herself. It was her stillness that drew his eye. Stillness had no place in the corridor, no sanctioned role. She was not moving fast enough, not bending to the rhythm the building demanded. Suspicion flickered across his expression, though he did not yet move. She drew closer. The distance between them shrank to a narrow space of polished tile. For a moment it seemed she would simply pass, her shoes clicking softly, her posture unbroken. Then the officer's arm extended. The motion was casual, as though instinct, as though he had made it 100 times before without consequence. His hand pressed against her shoulder and forced her aside. Not enough to send her to the ground, not enough to draw attention, just enough to mark her. Just enough to signal that she did not belong where she was walking, not in the manner she had chosen to walk. Her body shifted with the shove. A soft scuff rang out as her heel scraped against stone. She steadied herself, spine straightening again, eyes lifting not to him but to the empty space ahead. She made no sound. The officer's hand returned to his side. His face held no expression, only the blank readiness of someone who believed his gesture would dissolve into the air like all the others. He resumed his stance, feet apart, hands crossed behind his back. The badge caught the light again. For a moment the corridor seemed to stop. Papers stopped rustling. Conversations thinned. Even the fluorescent hum seemed sharper, as though silence had a new edge. People had seen, but no one would name it. Not here. Not in this corridor. The woman did not pause. She continued forward, her shoes striking rhythm again, though the faint scuff from the shove lingered on the floor behind her. Her dignity did not falter, but the mark had been made. A gesture rehearsed by habit, an enforcement more silent than law. At the bench near the wall, a clerk adjusted her glasses and bent closer to her stack of files, pretending focus. A man in a suit checked his watch with exaggerated care. The small rituals of avoidance, complicity masked as absorption. The corridor inhaled and exhaled again. The system had absorbed the moment, yet the image remained. Her back straight, her eyes forward. The faint scrape of leather against stone echoing longer than footsteps should. The badge glinting, the hand returning to stillness as if nothing had been done. The corridor had no memory, but she carried it with her. The hearing chamber was designed to impose. Every surface carried the weight of authority. Wood paneling lacquered to a dull sheen, heavy drapes framing tall windows that allowed only slivers of daylight, the American flag hanging stiff behind the elevated dais. The carpet absorbed sound, swallowing footsteps so that nothing entered without consent. The air smelled faintly of polish and dust, as though permanence itself had been preserved in wax. At the far end of the long table, an empty chair waited. It was slightly larger than the others, its leather worn smoother, its back higher as if announcing a rank no one needed to explain. It was never occupied at the beginning of proceedings, always left vacant until the moment ritual demanded. Its absence was a presence. Clerks moved quietly across the room, placing folders in neat stacks. Attorneys murmured to one another in clipped phrases, voices kept low by habit more than necessity. Every sound was moderated by the space itself, as though the chamber insisted that nothing human rise above its solemn order. The officer entered first, posture still rigid from the corridor. He positioned himself at the side of the chamber, near the double doors, hands folded behind his back. His gaze fixed straight ahead, the line of his jaw tight. He did not move, but awareness sharpened in the angle of his body. He knew she was there. The woman sat halfway down the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. No papers, no pen. Nothing in front of her but the smooth surface of polished wood. She did not speak, did not lean forward, did not allow her eyes to dart. Her stillness was not passivity but intent, a silence that claimed space in a room meant to diminish it. Others noticed her. Their glances were brief, discreet, but undeniable. A woman alone at a table usually filled with documents and authority. A black woman in a chamber whose portraits lining the walls told a different lineage. Rows of pale faces framed in gilt. Judges and legislators staring out with painted severity. She sat beneath them without bowing. The officer's eyes flicked once toward her, then forward again. The movement was small, but the hostility was clear, the kind sharpened by restraint. He could not shove her here. He could not command her to move. But his posture spoke the same language, that she was watched, measured, categorized as anomaly. The chamber waited. The officials began to file in, one by one, their suits dark, their movements choreographed by protocol. Chairs scraped softly as they took their places, papers shuffled, voices hushed. The empty chair at the end of the table remained vacant, its silence commanding more attention than the people filling the others. The woman did not turn her head to watch them arrive. She sat as though she had already been here longer than any of them, as though the room had arranged itself around her presence rather than the reverse, her silence pressed against theirs, equal in weight. The officer shifted slightly, the faintest movement of a boot on carpet. No one else noticed, but the sound punctuated the stillness like a pin dropped in a cathedral. His eyes darted again toward her profile. She did not return the look. Time lengthened. The chamber filled not with noise, but with the density of waiting. The officials at the table murmured among themselves. Clerks passed documents hand to hand, yet beneath it all, silence persisted, not as absence, but as enforcement. Every ritual of posture, every suppressed cough, every moderated tone affirmed the rule. Power was not spoken freely here. It was rationed. The woman's stillness became sharper in contrast. She was not playing by the chamber's rules of silence as submission. Her silence was different, not compliance but refusal, not an absence of voice but an insistence on dignity without words. The officer felt it. His throat tightened, though no sound left it. His uniform fit too snugly across his shoulders as if the air had thickened. He had been trained to read movements to anticipate disturbance, but here there was no motion to read. Only the unshakable presence of someone who did not yield. The empty chair at the end of the table remained unclaimed, its high back like a sentinel watching them all. It gathered the silence around it, an emblem of authority deferred. The room orbited its vacancy as though awaiting judgment not yet delivered. At last the gavel struck once against the dais. The sound cracked the air, loud and deliberate, before dissolving back into stillness. All eyes turned toward the elevated bench. Ritual had begun. The woman's gaze did not move. The officer's jaw tightened again. The chamber swallowed them all. It had been a small thing. That was how he would remember it, if he remembered at all. A passing gesture, unthinking, no more deliberate than brushing lint from a sleeve. But the body remembers differently. The corridor had been crowded that morning. Lawyers hurrying, defendants muttering to themselves, clerks balancing towers of files. The officer stood where the flow narrowed, where his body could shape the traffic of the hall. He was trained for that, to redirect, to assert presence without question. She had walked straight toward him, her pace unbroken, her posture level. It was not arrogance, not even defiance. It was dignity. And dignity read as threat in spaces calibrated for submission. The moment slowed. His arm rose without thought, palm angled outward, the leather of his glove creasing as it met her shoulder. The push was not violent, not enough to draw eyes in, but deliberate enough to claim territory. A pressure meant to remind. A pressure rehearsed move. The word was low, almost muttered, but sharp with entitlement. It carried the weight of habit, of repetition across years, across countless hallways and countless bodies displaced. Her heel struck the tile at an angle. The sound was sharper than it should have been, a scuff cutting through the fluorescent hum. Her body tilted slightly, coat slipping against her arm, one hand tightening to hold it in place. For a fraction of a second, her balance faltered. The air itself seemed to sharpen. The push was ordinary, but the humiliation was not. Humiliation travels differently, silent but searing, invisible but permanent. She did not look at him. She did not speak. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared again where his hand had pressed. The correction was almost imperceptible but absolute. He lowered his hand, expression fixed as though nothing had passed between them. His gaze returned to the corridor ahead, jaw set in the practiced neutrality of the uniform. For him, the act dissolved into routine. But the bruise was not on skin. The bruise was in the silence that followed, a silence heavier than any echo. Lawyers kept walking. Clerks shuffled files. Someone coughed at the far end of the hall. The ordinary resumed, but beneath it ran a current of recognition. Something had been done and no one would name it. Her shoes clicked again, rhythm restored, though the memory of the scuff lingered. She carried the weight of the touch forward, each step reclaiming what had been displaced. The officer's badge caught the light once more. It gleamed cold, indifferent, as if the metal itself had witnessed nothing. Yet the corridor remembered. Not in sound, not in record, but in the air itself. That slight shift, that tremor of dignity met with cruelty. Silence answering silence. The shove had been small, but it was everything. Days later, another chamber. Not the courthouse this time, but the council hall of the city. The architecture echoed the same intention. Walls paneled in wood, flags stationed at each corner, raised dais commanding the eye. Yet here the scale was larger, the ceilings higher, the silence more orchestrated. Rows of seats faced the long desk where council members would soon take their places. The air carried the faint scent of dust and varnish, the odor of old governance preserved. The officer was there again, uniform pressed, shoes polished. He had been assigned to the perimeter, one of several guards stationed at measured intervals along the chamber walls. His posture was the same, spine rigid, hands clasped behind him, gaze fixed forward. But his body betrayed a trace of restlessness. Small shifts of weight from one foot to the other, a subtle tightening of the jaw. His presence was meant to be invisible, yet he was acutely aware of being seen. Officials began to arrive in slow procession. Their voices were low, their faces set with ceremony. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor punctuated the otherwise heavy quiet. Papers were spread, water glasses filled, microphones adjusted with discreet clicks. Every action was performed as if under watch, because it was. At the center of the long desk, another chair waited. It was not empty by accident. It had been reserved, elevated by its vacancy, drawing the gaze of every person in the hall. That chair announced its occupant long before she entered. The officer glanced at it once. His eyes returned forward quickly, but the glance lingered inside him. Something in him braced, though he did not know for what. The chamber filled. A clerk whispered instructions into a microphone. The hum of anticipation thickened, a silence too heavy to be natural. Every cough, every shuffle of feet sounded like a rupture. Then the double doors opened. She entered. Her steps were measured, deliberate, echoing against the chamber floor. She wore a dark suit this time, cut sharp, her coat resting across one arm. An ID badge gleamed against the lapel, a small square of plastic carrying authority no one could dispute. She walked the central aisle without hurry, the same rhythm of heels against stone that had marked the corridor days earlier. The officer's breath caught, though his chest did not rise. Recognition struck him with the force of silence. The woman he had shoved aside without thought, without pause, without consequence, now crossing the chamber not as subject but as sovereign. The council members rose in unison. Some applauded, some only straightened, but all acknowledged. The chamber itself seemed to bow in ritual. The officer did not move. He could not. His uniform pinned him to the wall. She reached the long desk, paused at the vacant chair, and then sat. Not hurried, not hesitant, simply claimed what had always been marked for her. The gavel struck once against the wood. The sound cracked through the hall, final and resonant, as though sealing something larger than procedure. Silence followed. She looked across the chamber. her gaze sweeping the council, the officials, the public observers. Then her eyes found him. The moment stretched. Her expression did not change. No triumph, no anger, no recognition made visible. Only stillness. But the weight of her gaze pressed harder than any words could have. It fixed him where he stood, uniform and badge suddenly brittle against it. He did not return the look. He stared ahead, eyes rigid, but the silence betrayed him. His body knew what his face refused. The chamber held its breath. The applause had ceased. The ritual words of welcome had not yet begun. For a span of seconds, all authority rested in the space between her gaze and his posture. Then the clerk cleared his throat and began to read the agenda. Voices rose again, measured and official. Papers shuffled. The ritual resumed. But the silence of that moment lingered, carved into the chamber like an inscription no gavel could erase. Silence had always been the officer's refuge. In silence, he could disappear into uniform, become part of the walls and doors and wood paneling. Silence excused him from having to explain, from having to answer. It was the shield of the institution itself. No words, only presence. A presence that needed no justification, but silence in this chamber no longer belonged to him. He stood at his post as he always had, posture rigid, gaze trained forward. He avoided her deliberately. He had practiced this avoidance before with others with ease. To look away had always been enough, but here the avoidance became visible. Each time his eyes refused her direction, the refusal was louder than speech. She sat at the head of the chamber now, the vacant chair claimed as her own. Papers before her, microphone angled, the seal of the city gleaming above her head. But it was not the desk, nor the dais, nor even the gavel that carried the weight. It was the badge clipped to her lapel, small rectangular plastic, an object so ordinary it should have gone unnoticed. But under the fluorescent lights, its laminated surface gleamed with authority no uniform could displace. Her name printed cleanly across it, her photograph steady, her title unambiguous. Mayor. The officer's badge caught the same light, glinting at intervals across the chamber. Two symbols of authority, both metallic, both sanctioned, but only one now commanded the room. His badge had been forged by force, hers by mandate. He could not dismiss hers. He could not erase it. So he remained silent. He told himself the silence was discipline, that guards did not speak, that neutrality was his role. Yet his silence was heavier than duty. It pressed against his chest, against the air, against the chamber itself. The silence became confession. Yes, it was him. Yes, he had shoved her. Yes, he had believed her presence could be moved as easily as a body in a hallway. She did not look at him. She had no need. Her silence was not avoidance but sovereignty. By refusing to acknowledge him, she placed him where he could not escape. Invisible, peripheral, powerless. He was not her adversary. He was not even her equal. He was nothing to be named. The chamber filled with other silences. The silence of officials glancing but not speaking, of clerks moving papers without sound, of council members adjusting ties and glasses with exaggerated focus. The silence was not empty. It was enforcement. It reminded all present of what was allowed to be said and what must remain unsaid. Within that weight, her silence was different. It was not the silence of permission or compliance. It was the silence of judgment withheld. She did not name his act, did not expose him. She let the silence do it for her. The longer it stretched, the clearer it became. Every time her badge caught the light, it reminded him. Every time his gaze flickered away, it admitted him guilty. The gavel struck once to end the session. The sound reverberated through the chamber, final and echoing. Yet when it faded, the silence that remained was heavier still. The officer exhaled, though no one heard it. He shifted his weight again, a fraction as though the floor beneath him had tilted. She gathered her papers with unhurried precision. She rose, the badge gleamed once more, small but absolute. Without glance or word, she walked from the chamber, and he stood rooted in silence, confession unspoken, judgment delivered without speech. Her office was not yet personal. The walls were bare, the bookshelves half empty, the desk cleared of everything except what the transition team had left for her. No photographs, no ornaments, no gestures of warmth. Only function. It was late. The blinds were drawn. The city beyond reduced to faint smudges of light against glass. A desk lamp burned steadily, throwing a narrow circle across the wood. Within that circle lay the files, Stacks of manila folders arranged in rigid columns, each one thick, each one labeled in the same block handwriting. At first glance they looked identical, but their weight differed, their contents shifting against the cardboard as though restless. They sat like a wall, silent, accusatory, immovable. She opened the first. The language inside was flat, procedural. Complaint forms, incident reports, internal reviews, words chosen to drain heat from harm, allegations summarized in sterile phrases, use of force, non-compliance, resisting directives. The voices of the citizens appeared only as fragments, quoted sparingly, pressed between margins designed to minimize them. She read without visible reaction. Each page turned with the same measured motion, the same steady hand. Her face gave nothing away. Another file. Another. Patterns emerged, the same names recurring across years. Officers shielded by repetition, their misconduct diluted into bureaucracy. Cases closed without action. Citations withdrawn. Complaints marked unsubstantiated despite multiple witnesses. The machinery of dismissal revealed itself line by line. Her eyes paused when she reached his name. It appeared more than once. Not a single complaint, not an isolated incident, but a pattern, scattered across years, buried in language crafted to soften. Alleged shove. Alleged verbal escalation. Subject claimed unnecessary contact. Each one filed, reviewed, dismissed. Her hand remained steady on the page. She did not lift her head, did not allow the silence in the room to break, yet the charge of that silence thickened, filling the air between her and the files. The officer's name repeated, stamped in black ink, his badge number anchoring each report. The bureaucracy had built a paper fortress around him. Still, the fortress leaked. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to see. She turned another page. The language was the same, neutral, bureaucratic, drained of urgency. But beneath the neutrality, violence pulsed. The push, the shove, the grip on an arm, rendered into lines of text as if harmless. The documents tried to reduce bruises to paperwork, silence to procedure. The stacks on her desk grew taller as she worked. Each closed folder added to the wall of muted accusations. They did not shout. They did not weep. They only sat, their silence louder than words. Hours passed. She did not move from the chair. Her posture remained straight, her hands precise, her expression composed. Only the slow, steady rhythm of turning pages marked time. The lamp burned lower, casting longer shadows across the desk. The files remained, their weight unchanged, their silence insistent. When she finally stopped, she placed her hand flat on the nearest folder. Not a gesture of fatigue, not one of despair. A gesture of acknowledgement. The system had buried these voices. She would not. She closed the lamp, leaving the files in darkness. The room was small compared to the council chamber, but no less deliberate. A long oval table dominated the center, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. Around it sat the leadership of the city's police department, the chief, deputy chiefs, legal counsel, union representatives. Their suits were dark, their ties conservative, their faces drawn into masks of professional neutrality. At the head of the table sat the mayor. She had no aides beside her, no stack of briefing papers in front of her. Only a single glass of water had been placed at her right hand. Beads of condensation formed against its surface, running downward in slow rivulets pooling onto the coaster beneath. She did not touch it. The officer stood near the wall. Assigned to guard detail, he was positioned behind the chief, his uniform visible in the reflection of the polished wood. He told himself he was only background, but his body knew otherwise. Every muscle taut, every shift of weight magnified by the awareness of her presence. The meeting began. The chief spoke first, voice clipped but steady, reciting statistics. Reductions in crime, increases in response time, departmental efficiency metrics. His words moved like filings in a report, ordered, calculated, drained of life. Each phrase was meant to project competence, to forestall criticism. The mayor listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on him, her face impassive. She gave no sign of agreement, no sign of disapproval, only stillness. One by one, others joined. A deputy spoke of budgetary needs, another of training initiatives. The union representative, his tone rehearsed, invoked the difficulty of the job. the danger officers faced daily. Each voice sought to fill the air, to preempt silence with performance, but the silence was hers. When she finally spoke, the room stilled. Her words were few. Directives, not speeches. She asked for transparency in misconduct records. She asked for community engagement to be prioritized in budgets. She asked for disciplinary actions to be reviewed independently. Her sentences were short, unembellished, but each carried weight. They were not requests. They were commands. The officers around the table shifted in their chairs. Some scribbled notes, others stared at the polished surface of the table as though it could absorb their discomfort. The glass of water remained untouched, condensation now forming a small circle beneath it. The slow spread of moisture mirrored the slow spread of unease across the room. The officer at the wall felt the weight of every word. Though none were directed at him, they struck with precision. Each directive threatened the shield that had protected him, the shield of silence, of buried files, of procedural dismissal. Then her eyes met his. It was brief, a glance only, but it unfastened something in him. His posture faltered, shoulders tightening, breath caught shallow. For a moment, he was no longer the uniform at the wall, but the man in the file, the name repeated in complaint after complaint. She did not linger on him. Her gaze moved back to the table, to the men in suits shifting uneasily, yet the glance had been enough. His silence, his rigidity became exposure. The meeting ended without ceremony. The chief promised follow-up reports. The union representative muttered about ongoing dialogue. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped, the ritual gestures of adjournment. The mayor rose. She still had not touched the water. The circle of condensation remained, spreading outward, a quiet witness to the weight of what had not been spoken. She left the room without another word. The officer exhaled, the sound loud in his own ears. His hands, clasped behind his back, felt damp. The glass of water still sat on the table, untouched, slowly emptying itself into silence. The neighborhood bore its history openly. Blocks of brick row houses stood weathered, their paint chipped, their windows patched with plastic. Storefronts were shuttered in steel, graffiti layered over graffiti until words became illegible, only color and desperation bleeding through. The air carried a faint tang of rust and asphalt, the residue of neglect. The mayor walked the cracked sidewalk with steady steps. She wore no podium smile, no stage performance of warmth. Her hands remained at her sides, her gaze moving deliberately across the streets, the buildings, the faces that appeared in doorways and windows. She was not here to be welcomed. She was here to see. Behind her, the officer followed. His uniform was pressed as always, but here it carried a different weight. It did not project order. It reminded. Every glance that landed on him was sharp, cautious, remembering. He shifted more than usual, his boots heavy against the uneven pavement, his eyes darting where hers remained fixed. Children appeared first. They gathered in small knots near the edges of the block, some perched on stoops, others crouched low with chalk in hand. On the broken pavement they had drawn bright figures, suns with long rays, stick people holding hands, houses with square windows. The colors pressed against the gray surface, fragile declarations of life in a space scarred by absence. The mayor paused near one of the drawings, a crooked circle of blue sky pressed against cracks in the cement. She lowered her head slightly, not bending to touch, only acknowledging. The child who had drawn it stared back at her, chalk still in hand, body stiff as though caught in a forbidden act. She did not smile, did not perform approval. She simply looked long enough for the child to see that she had seen. The officer lingered several steps behind. He shifted, the leather of his belt creaking. His eyes avoided the chalk drawings, tracing instead the boarded-up storefronts, the broken glass at the curb. He felt the gaze of the children on him, their silence heavier than any shout. The mayor resumed walking. Residents emerged as she passed, an older woman leaning on a railing, a man in work boots with arms folded, a teenager with earbuds dangling silent around his neck. They did not call out to her, did not greet. Their silence was not hostility but testimony. The neighborhood itself spoke without words. We are still here, we remember. Her presence did not erase the history of sirens, of cuffs, of doors kicked open. She did not pretend it did. She walked with the weight of that history pressing at her back, unsoftened, unhidden. The officer's discomfort deepened with every block. His presence, once shield, now exposed him, Here in these streets, his uniform was not invisible. It was accusation. He could not hide behind silence. The silence here was not his. At the end of the block, she stopped. The pavement was broken, weeds forcing through the cracks. The children had drawn there too. A house with no door, only windows, bright yellow sun above it. The chalk lines cut across the fissures in the cement, colors bending with the fractures, hope drawn over brokenness. She stood still, letting the image settle. She did not speak. The officer stopped behind her, posture rigid but unstable. The children stared, their chalk held still in their hands. Their silence pressed against him, unrelenting. She turned finally to leave the block. The children did not follow. They bent again to the ground, resuming their drawings. Chalk against cracked stone. Color against history. As she walked away, the officer kept his distance, his boots grinding faintly against grit. The drawings remained behind them, fragile and insistent, etched against the fractures that no patrol could erase. The headlines arrived first. They spread across the city in bold black letters. Each word chosen not for nuance but for impact. Mayor releases misconduct files. Below, subheadings cataloged the failures, patterns of force, dismissed complaints. Officers named without shield of anonymity. The officer sat at a metal table in the precinct break room. A stack of newspapers lay folded in front of him, the ink still smelling faintly of press oil. The television mounted in the corner carried the same story, the mayor's voice excerpted in clipped sentences. Transparency is not optional. Accountability is not negotiable. He opened the paper. His own name appeared 3 columns down, his badge number beside it. The words were familiar, drawn directly from the files he had never expected to see daylight. Alleged shove, alleged unnecessary contact, alleged escalation. Each line sterile, bureaucratic but exposed now to public sight. He stared at the print until the letters blurred. His thumb pressed against the margin, leaving a faint gray smudge across the paper. When he lifted his hand, the ink stained his skin, dark, undeniable. Around him, the room was thick with silence. His colleagues sat at other tables, some pretending to read, others fiddling with phones, coffee cups, anything to avoid looking at him. No one spoke his name, but their silence did. The silence pressed harder than accusation, sharper than words. He remembered the shove. The memory replayed not in words, but in fragments. The feel of her shoulder beneath his palm. The scuff of her heel against tile, the word move muttered through clenched teeth. He saw again the straightening of her back, the refusal to turn, the silence that had followed like a wound. The scene had been small, forgettable in his mind. Now it was everywhere, expanded into symbol, printed into record. He turned the page. More names. More incidents. Officers he knew, their habits familiar. Each line rendered with the same cold neutrality, stripped of excuse. Together they formed a pattern too heavy to dismiss. The system's rot laid bare in columns of text. The officer's hand tightened on the paper until it crumpled. Ink smeared deeper across his fingers into the creases of his skin. He rubbed them against his uniform trousers, but the black marks remained. The television continued. Footage of the mayor at a podium, her ID badge glinting, her voice steady. She spoke of dignity, of transparency, of the city's duty to its people. She did not raise her tone. She did not need to. Her calmness struck harder than condemnation. He lowered his eyes, unable to watch. The silence in the room grew thicker. Even the hum of the vending machine seemed sharper, like static under pressure. Every cough, every scrape of a chair sounded deliberate, as though marking the absence of words. He folded the newspaper slowly, hands unsteady, lines of ink blurring against his palms. The stain would not come off. The break room clock ticked overhead, marking each second with mechanical indifference. The room did not move. The silence held. The officer knew then it would not end with a headline. The system had turned its gaze inward, and his name was written into the record. The ink darkened as it dried on his hands. The mayor's office was stripped of ornament. No framed photographs on the walls, no clutter on the desk. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon light, the slats cutting the sun into narrow strips. Across the room, the shadows fell in clean bars against the carpet, the desk, the chairs. Against his uniform. He stood just inside the door, summoned and waiting. His posture mimicked attention, but his shoulders betrayed strain. Sweat formed at the base of his neck despite the cool air. She sat at the desk, her hands folded neatly before her. The glass of water stood again at her side, untouched. Papers stacked with clinical precision. No movement wasted. For a long time she did not speak. Her silence filled the room, thick as judgment. The blinds shifted slightly in the breeze of the vent, bars of light sliding across his chest like restraints. Then she looked directly at him. "You shoved me." The words were not raised, not sharpened. They were delivered as fact. Each syllable carried the weight of record, not memory. He opened his mouth, but nothing followed. The air caught in his throat. His lips closed again, soundless. She did not look away. In the courthouse lobby, without cause, without hesitation, her voice remained steady, but the room bent around it. Every detail, the tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the air vent, seemed to arrange itself in service of her words. The officer's gaze dropped. His boots pressed against the carpet, his breath shallow. She continued, still calm. "That act was not yours alone. It was the system rehearsing itself through you. Every silence that followed made it possible. Every silence before." The blinds threw sharper bars across his uniform as the sun shifted. The shadow pressed at his chest like a verdict. He tried again to speak, to deny, to excuse, to apologize, but the air in the room allowed no escape. Each attempt collapsed into silence, his voice swallowed before it formed. She did not demand his answer. She did not press. The absence of rage, the absence of raised voice, was heavier than any confrontation he had known. The clock ticked. The blinds shifted. The silence remained. When she finally moved, it was only to close the file before her. The sound of paper against wood marked the end. "You may go," she said. Nothing more. No threat, no promise, only dismissal. He turned toward the door, his steps slow, deliberate, the weight of his uniform heavier than it had ever been. The blind shadow stretched across his back until he crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, the bars of light remained, empty now, marking the room like a held sentence.
"You don't belong here." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they pulsed in the air like a poison, unspoken yet unmistakable. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence was served with the same precision as the wine, where polished crystal chandeliers glowed like captive stars, and every plate was a work of art. Waiters glided across the floor with rehearsed grace, and laughter from well-dressed patrons floated in the air like smoke rings, soft, controlled, delicate. This was a sanctuary for the powerful, the wealthy, the untouchable. But tonight their sanctuary was about to be shattered. It began with a sound, not the clink of cutlery, not the pop of a champagne cork, but a scream, raw, sharp, unfiltered. It tore through the velvet calm of the room like glass breaking on marble. Heads turned, forks froze mid-air. The music from the piano faltered for just a heartbeat, as though even the keys had been startled. And at the center of it all, a boy sat clutching his ears, his small frame rocking, his face twisted in agony that no one in the room could truly understand. His father, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in boardrooms and financial circles, sat frozen beside him. His tailored suit fit like armor, his wristwatch worth more than most cars in the parking lot. But here, in this moment, he looked like every other parent in the world, helpless, frightened, desperate. He reached for his son, whispering something only the boy could hear, but the cries only grew louder. Around them, discontent stirred. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, her lips curling in disapproval. A businessman shifted uncomfortably, his voice low and sharp. Can't he control his kid? Another patron raised an eyebrow, as if the very idea of imperfection in this temple of perfection was offensive. The stares multiplied, heavy as stones, invisible yet crushing, and still the boy screamed. This was not just a sound. This was a plea for understanding, a voice no one seemed willing to hear. It echoed against the gilded walls, against the polished marble floor, against the hollow hearts of those who believed money could buy peace. In a room built for control and order, chaos had arrived in the form of a child. The father's hand trembled as he tried again to comfort him, but doubt gnawed at his eyes. Doubt and shame. He could weather hostile takeovers and financial storms. But here, under the judgmental gaze of strangers, he was losing a battle he couldn't fight with numbers or contracts. And somewhere across the room, a waitress paused. Her tray of sparkling glasses tilted slightly as her gaze settled on the boy. She heard what others dismissed as noise. She saw what others ignored. The storm was not just disrupting service. It was breaking hearts, though most of them were too hardened to notice. Stay with me, because what happened next would change everything.
The corridor stretched long and bare, unchanged from before. Fluorescent light hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. The floor gleamed with its same cold polish. Every scuff of rubber or leather marked clearly in the silence. Benches lined the walls, unoccupied, their wooden backs waiting as though for witnesses yet to arrive. The mayor entered. Her pace was steady, deliberate, each step sounding against the tiles with calm precision. At her side moved members of her security detail, not ornamental but purposeful. Their presence was not intimidation. It was affirmation. The corridor no longer belonged to chance encounters. The officer stood further down, pressed against the wall. His posture, once rigid, had softened into something uncertain, broken in shape, though not in uniform. The badge still hung at his chest, its metal catching the light. But the reflection seemed duller now, its authority unguarded. She approached, her stride unbroken. Once his hand had extended, casual in its cruelty, to shove her aside. Once his voice had muttered command, reduced her to obstruction. Now he did not move. He did not speak. His silence, once a weapon, had become confession. She passed him without a glance. Her eyes fixed ahead, not to dismiss but to deny him the center he once occupied. Her presence carried weight enough. The air itself seemed to shift in her wake, the corridor reorganizing around the fact of her authority. His body leaned faintly back as if to create space where none was needed. His boots held the floor, but his posture faltered. The line of his shoulders sloped downward, uniform bending under invisible pressure. Her footsteps echoed, steady and unbroken. No shove this time, only the sound of her dignity crossing the distance. At the far end of the corridor, the doors opened. Light spilled through, bright against the sterile glow of fluorescence. She stepped into it without pause, her detail following. The sound of her movement carrying into the next space, into the future that waited. Behind her, the corridor remained unchanged. Same light, same benches, same silence. But the act had altered it. What had once been a stage for enforcement had become a passage of restraint, of triumph unannounced but undeniable. The officer stayed at the wall, motionless, bound not by command but by what had already passed. His silence stretched long, echoing only against himself. The corridor hummed on. The footsteps lingered longest, etched into the space as if the tiles themselves had absorbed their rhythm. Not a shove, not a command, only movement forward, one act of dignity set against centuries of enforcement. The corridor held the sound. The system bore its mark.